In the dry, cracked summer of 1987, 26-year-old Veda Marsh. No, let me start again, because the place matters as much as the person. In the dry, cracked summer of 1987, 26-year-old Veda Croft stood at the edge of her father's beehives and listened to the silence. That was the wrong kind of silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning or the held-breath stillness before a rainstorm. This was the silence of absence, of 43 wooden hive boxes sitting in the Nebraska panhandle sun, their painted lids bleached pale as old bone and almost nothing flying in or out. 3 years ago, those same boxes had hummed, so loudly you could hear them from the gravel road. Her father, Leonard Croft, used to say you could tell the health of the whole county by standing at those hives and closing your eyes. If the bees were working, the land was breathing. If the bees went quiet, something had broken. Something had broken. Leonard had died in February quietly, the way men of his particular stubbornness tend to die, not from any dramatic illness but from a slow accumulation of worry that eventually just wore his heart out. He left Veda the farm, 220 acres of alfalfa and clover fields in Dunning County, Nebraska, the farmhouse with the warped kitchen floor, a 1974 Ford truck that pulled hard to the left, and 43 beehives in various states of collapse. He also left her his notebooks, not account ledgers, not equipment manuals, 40 years of observations, written in the cramped, careful hand of a man who had spent more of his life watching than talking. The notebooks were filled with things like, April 14, Cloverfield east of the creek smells wrong this year, like metal after rain, or second week of June, bees working the alfalfa but not bringing back pollen, just nectar, something missing, or, in the final notebook, from 3 winters before his death, a single underlined sentence. The bees are following the flowers, but the flowers have forgotten how to make food. Veda had read that sentence a dozen times before she understood what her father meant. She had a degree in environmental biology from the University of Nebraska, a degree Leonard had quietly, stubbornly worked 2 extra jobs to help pay for, never once complaining about it, never once suggesting she come home and help with the bees. He believed in her education the way he believed in the hives. With a faith that was patient and absolute, she had come back anyway, after graduation, because the farm needed her, and because she had never quite been able to picture herself anywhere else. What she found when she came back was a farm at the edge of a long, slow crisis. The alfalfa fields looked fine from the road, green enough, standing tall enough, but the yields were down for the 3rd year running. The honey production had dropped by nearly half, and the bee colonies themselves were dwindling in ways that no single cause could explain. Veda had watched her father chase that problem for years, replacing queens, treating for mites, rotating the hives, without ever finding the answer. And the answer, she had begun to suspect, wasn't in the hives at all. It was in the fields around them. The farms neighboring the Croft land had changed over the past decade. The Halstead operation to the north had converted most of its acreage to commodity corn. The family to the south had leased their fields to an agricultural management company that ran a tight, efficient rotation of corn and soybeans, sprayed on a calendar schedule, regardless of weather or pest pressure. The family just east had sold outright, and the new owner had torn out the windbreaks to maximize tillable acres. The county, in the span of a single generation, had transformed from a patchwork of small, diverse operations into a landscape of near monoculture, chemically maintained and ruthlessly efficient. In isolation, each decision made sense. Economically, anyway, but Veda, standing at the hives with her father's notebooks under her arm, was beginning to understand what that transformation had cost. The bees were telling her, in their diminishing numbers, and their strange truncated flights, and their too quiet boxes. The landscape had become a desert wearing the costume of a farm. It looked productive. It was exhausting itself. So she decided to do something that the men at the county extension office would later describe in the patient tones reserved for the well-intentioned but deluded as entirely impractical. She decided to turn 40 acres of her best alfalfa ground not into a pollinator corridor, not the kind where you scatter a bag of wildflower seed along a fence line and call it habitat. What Veda had in mind was more systematic, more stubborn, and more expensive than anything the extension pamphlets suggested. She took the small amount her father had kept in a savings account, money he had set aside without explanation, in the way of men who know something might go wrong, and she spent it not on seed treatments or irrigation equipment or any of the sensible inputs her neighbors were purchasing. She spent it on plugs and bare root stock, native prairie plants, ordered from a restoration nursery 2 states away. Wild bergamot, purple coneflower, lead plant, compass plant, rattlesnake master. Species that had been growing in Nebraska soil for thousands of years before anyone thought to plow it. The woman at the grain elevator where Veda had always taken the alfalfa crop watched her load the flat after flat of native plants into the back of the Ford and said, with genuine concern in her voice, "Veda, honey, what in the world are you doing with all that?" "Converting the East 40, Veda said. The woman's expression was the particular kind that people wear when they want to ask if you're feeling all right but are too polite to say it directly. She settled for, "That's your best ground, though. Your daddy always said." "I know," Veda said, and drove away. The story traveled around Dunning County the way news does in small places, quickly and with embellishment. By the end of that first week, Veda had heard 3 different versions of what she was supposedly doing with the East 40, none of them accurate. The most charitable version was that she was planting some kind of herb garden. The least charitable involved the word eccentric and a lot of head shaking. Mr. Grover, who ran the largest farming operation in the county and whose opinion carried the weight of his acreage, heard about it at the co-op and made the short drive out to sea for himself. He was a man of direct speech and no particular malice, which somehow made what he said sting more than cruelty would have. He stood at the fence line watching Veda and her 2 hired hands setting plugs in the turned ground, and he said, "I knew your father well, Veda. Good man. Solid farmer. He'd have told you that ground won't carry sentiment. I'm not planting sentiment, Mr. Grover," she said without stopping work. "I'm planting habitat." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What's the return on habitat?" She didn't have an answer for that. Not in dollars. Not yet. He climbed back into his truck and drove away, and she watched the dust settle on the road and turned back to the work. A month later, the county agricultural agent came out. His name was Mr. Tully, and he was a decent enough man, the kind who believed earnestly in the literature he distributed, and who had spent 20 years telling farmers in Dunning County that their problems were solvable with the right product applied at the right rate. He walked the East 40 with Veda, looking at the plugs in their neat rows, and he did not laugh. He was too professional for that. But the pity in his voice was worse than laughter. "I understand what you're going for here," he said carefully. "The pollinator support angle, that's real, and I'm not dismissing it. But Veda, and I say this with respect for what your family has built here, you're taking 40 acres of producing ground out of production. Your alfalfa contract alone covered, what, 40% of your operating costs?" "About that," she said, "and you're replacing it with native forbs that won't produce any revenue for at least 2, maybe 3 years while they establish." He paused. "The math doesn't work." And beyond the math, I have to be honest with you, the Extension Service doesn't have a framework for what you're attempting here. We can't advise on it. We can't support it formally, and I'd hate to see you make a financial decision this significant without. My father spent 30 years watching the bees slow down, Veda said. He knew what was happening. He wrote it in his notebooks every year for a decade. He just couldn't see the way through. I think I can. Mr. Tully looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who respects conviction, but has seen conviction ruin farms before. I hope you're right, he said finally. He shook her hand and drove back to his office in town, where he would later mention Veda Croft's experiment at a meeting of the County Agricultural Committee as an example of the kind of decision-making that happened when she was not there to hear it. And then came the man from Consolidated Prairie Seed Company, whose name was Mr. Ashford, and who was in many ways the most dangerous of her three visitors. He did not arrive in a county vehicle or carry a clipboard. He arrived in a silver SUV with the company logo on the door and the particular ease of a man who had turned his salary into a single unified identity. He was friendly. He brought coffee in paper cups from the drive-through in town, which was a small gesture, but a carefully calculated one. He asked about her father first and listened to her answer and let the right amount of time pass before he pivoted to business. Here's the thing about what you're doing, he said, leaning against the fence with his coffee, looking at the East 40 with what she could only describe as manufactured admiration. I think it's beautiful. Genuinely. The native planting concept, the habitat restoration, the whole philosophy behind it. My company has been watching this space very closely, very closely. There's real movement in the market toward what you might call a regenerative story. Consumers want that, retailers want it, and a honey operation with a documented pollinator corridor with the right marketing support behind it. He paused to let her imagine it. That's a brand. That's something we could build together. He was offering her a partnership, proprietary seed mixes, company branding, a marketing infrastructure she couldn't build herself, and this was the important part, the part he said with particular care, the financial bridge to get through the establishment years. A loan, structured as an advance against future branded product sales. Clean. Easy. No waiting. All it would cost was the decision-making. The seed sourcing would become his company's. The corridor design would follow their template. The story they told about it would be theirs to tell. Let me ask you something, because I think you already know the answer. Have you ever been offered exactly what you thought you needed by someone who needed something from you in return? Have you ever stood in a field with 2 years of hard work ahead of you and someone holding out a shortcut and felt that pull? The logic of it is almost irresistible. It's not even greed, it's exhaustion. It's the simple human desire to not have to carry the thing alone. That was where Veda stood at the end of Mr. Ashford's pitch on a warm Tuesday afternoon in late spring, with 40 acres of plugs just beginning to show their first true leaves. Mr. Ashford, she said, looking not at him but at the field, my father's notebooks have a lot of entries about this ground. 40 years of watching what it does when you let it breathe, and what it does when you push it. He never made much money, but he understood the land the way you understand a person you've lived beside for a very long time. What you're describing, your company's template, your brand, your marketing story, that's not his land. That's a product that looks like his land. And she paused. I don't need a story. I need to solve the problem. Mr. Ashford looked at her the way people look at someone who has just declined to be reasonable. He nodded slowly. He put the lid back on his coffee cup. You'll spend 3 years learning what our seed mixes could tell you in 1 season, he said. Not harshly, just flatly. like a man reading a weather forecast. But I understand. Call me if you change your mind. He drove away. The silver SUV disappeared around the bend in the county road, and Veda stood there in the quiet with the unstructured, difficult future spread out around her in 40 acres of baby plants. I want to tell you about Leonard Croft because you can't understand what Veda was doing without understanding who taught her to look. He was not a formally educated man. He had finished high school in 1958, come home to the farm, and never left in any meaningful sense. He married late, had Veda late, and spent the years between learning to keep bees in the way that men learn things before YouTube. Slowly. From mistakes, from neighbors, from the bees themselves. He had a particular habit, which Veda remembered from childhood, of lying flat on his stomach in front of a hive entrance for 20 minutes at a time, watching the traffic. Not checking for problems, just watching. You can't know what's wrong, he told her once when she was 11 and found him in this position and asked what you know what's right. He applied this to everything. He kept weather records in the same notebooks as the bee observations and soil temperature readings and rough sketches of which fields the bees preferred in which months, and notes about the wildflowers along the creek that the neighbors had eventually sprayed out because they grew too close to the fences. He wrote down what he noticed without always understanding why it mattered. He was patient in the way that people are patient when they love something and don't know how else to show it. In the second-to-last notebook from the spring of what turned out to be his final healthy year, there was a passage that Veda had returned to more than any other. He had been watching the bees work a patch of volunteer wild bergamot at the far corner of the East 40, the patch she had never mowed because her father had specifically asked her not to, and he had written, "The girls go to the bergamot and they come back fat and happy. The alfalfa is 10 feet away and they ignore it after 9 in the morning. Why? The alfalfa runs out of something. The bergamot doesn't. What does the bergamot know?" She had stared at that page for an hour, the night after Mr. Ashford drove away. What does the bergamot know? He had never found the answer. She thought she was starting to understand it. The bergamot and the other native forbs didn't just produce pollen and nectar. They produced them in longer windows, in different chemical compositions, at different times of day, in response to different environmental triggers. The bees that worked monoculture crops, even good crops like alfalfa, were getting a narrow seasonal diet that left gaps. The native corridor, if it worked the way the research suggested, would fill those gaps. It would give the hives something they hadn't had in years, nutritional variety, a full diet instead of a feast followed by a fast. That was the secret her father had been circling for a decade. He had seen the bees choose the bergamot. He just didn't know yet that the bees were trying to tell him something about hunger. Now, let me explain exactly what was happening in the soil and in the hive boxes, because this part matters and the experts who visited Veda that summer had gotten it wrong. The Agricultural Extension Service measured bee health by colony count and honey yield, and, when problems arose, by pest and disease screening. Those were real measurements, and they captured real problems. But they missed the underlying issue the way a doctor who only checks for infection misses the patient who is slowly starving. The bees weren't sick exactly. They were malnourished. A honeybee colony needs protein from pollen to raise brood, to build young bees, to sustain the population through winter. When pollen sources are limited in variety, in quantity, or in timing, colonies raise fewer bees. The bees they raise are physiologically weaker, and the whole system becomes more vulnerable to every other stressor: mites, viruses, weather, pesticide exposure. The colony doesn't collapse dramatically. It just slowly thins, like a person who isn't eating quite enough month after month. By the time the thinning is obvious, the underlying cause has been in place for years. What the native corridor would provide, if the plant's established, if the bloom sequence worked, the way Veda had designed it from her father's observations and the restoration ecology research she had spent the winter reading, was a staggered, season-long sequence of diverse pollen sources: wild bergamot blooming in late June, purple coneflower through July, lead plant through August, the late-season asters and goldenrods that commercial farms had been eliminating for decades, which were, it turned out, exactly what bees needed to build up the fat reserves that carried them through winter. She wasn't adding inputs. She wasn't treating a symptom. She was rebuilding a system that the landscape around her had spent 20 years dismantling, one herbicide pass at a time. The first 2 years were a study in patience and doubt. The establishment period for native prairie plantings is brutal in a particular way. Not because the work is hard, though it is, but because you cannot see whether it's working. The plants spend their first 2 seasons doing almost everything underground, building root systems that go 6, 8, 10 feet into the Nebraska soil. Above ground, they look like almost nothing, thin, sparse, frequently overwhelmed by the weeds that are faster and more opportunistic. Veda spent an enormous amount of time on her knees that first summer, hand-weeding around plants that barely came up to her wrist. The neighbors, when they drove past, saw a 40-acre field that looked like it had gotten away from her. The county road ran along one side of the East 40, and there was no way to drive past without seeing the sparse, weedy-looking planting and comparing it unfavorably to Mr. Grover's clean corn rows a quarter-mile north. The co-op where she bought her supplies had become a quiet theater of expressions that said, without saying it, that they were watching and they had their doubts. She had her doubts too, not about the science the research held, but about herself, about whether she had the nerve for it, the sustained nerve, the kind that doesn't flare up dramatically, but has to be replenished quietly every single morning. In the first week of August in the second year, a heat dome settled over the panhandle and sat there for 12 days. The plugs she had worked hardest to establish in the dry center of the field looked, at the end of that heat wave, like they had given up entirely. Brown, flat, gone. She stood in the middle of that field on a Thursday evening with the heat still radiating up from the ground and the sun going orange and flat in the west, and for the first time since she had started this, she genuinely could not see the path forward. She had spent the savings account. She had lost a significant portion of her alfalfa contract. The hives had not recovered. If anything, they were slightly worse that season because the corridor wasn't producing yet and the stress of the surrounding landscape hadn't changed. She was in a hole of her own digging, and the only way out was patience, and patience requires faith, and in the heat of that August, she was running low on faith. She went back to the farmhouse and sat at the kitchen table, the one with the warped floor, and she opened the last notebook. Her father had written in the final weeks before he went to the hospital a passage she had read but not quite absorbed until that moment. He had been watching the hives in October, watching the bees cluster for winter, and he wrote, "I have been keeping bees for 40 years, and the thing I have never learned to tolerate is the long wait. The bees know something in October that I won't see proof of until May. The only faith I know how to practice is to keep the hives dry, keep the mites down, and trust that what I've built is solid enough to carry them through the dark." He had added, almost as an afterthought, in pencil rather than pen, softer and harder to read, "Veda is like that, I think. She'll carry." She sat with that for a long time. Then she made herself a cup of coffee, went back out to the field, in the last of the evening light, crouched down in the heat-damaged section and dug her hand carefully into the soil around one of the apparently dead lead plants. 6 inches down, the root was alive, pale and firm, and alive, pushing deeper. She was not wrong. She was just early. The 3rd summer was the first time she believed. In June, the wild bergamot bloomed across the East 40 in a wash of pale lavender that was visible from the county road. Veda was at the hives on the morning the bloom opened, and she stood very still and listened, in the way her father had taught her, and the hives were not silent, they were working. Not at full capacity. The colony numbers were still recovering, but the traffic in and out of the hive entrances had a different quality than it had had for years. The bees were coming back loaded, full pollen baskets in colors she hadn't seen in a long time. Deep gold, pale yellow, dusty orange, a blue-gray that she identified from her father's notes as the particular pollen of the lead plant. They were bringing back a variety. They were eating a real meal. She pulled a frame that September and found something she had not seen since she was a child watching her father work. The deep, dark amber of what beekeepers call bee bread. Fermented pollen stores packed into the cells around the brood. A colony stores bee bread for winter, the way a family puts up preserves. The presence of it, in quantity and variety, meant the bees had enough, more than enough. She sent a sample of honey from that autumn's harvest to the State University for analysis. It came back with a pollen profile unlike anything the lab had seen from Dunning County before. 42 distinct pollen types, including 7 native species that the county hadn't reliably produced in decades. The biologist who ran the test emailed her with a question, and they ended up on the phone for an hour. He was not the last researcher to call. The subsequent years unfolded the way her father's notebooks had always suggested they might, if someone had the nerve to let them. The 5th year, a late spring frost followed by a drought killed a significant portion of the alfalfa crop across the county. Monoculture operations took heavy losses. The uniformity of those fields, which looked like strength, turned out to be brittleness. When one thing went wrong, everything went wrong. Veda's operation was different. The native corridor plants, which had root systems now reaching 12 feet into the Nebraska aquifer, were largely unaffected, and the bees, whose colonies had rebuilt to nearly pre-collapse levels, were healthy enough to weather the reduced forage of a drought year without catastrophic losses. She lost some. She didn't lose everything. That autumn, her honey yield per hive was the highest it had been in 15 years. She ran the numbers twice because she didn't trust them the first time. It wasn't a dramatic margin, not the kind of turnaround that makes a person rich overnight. But it was real, and it was documented, and when she posted the figures to the small online community of pollinator-focused beekeepers she had been quietly participating in since the 2nd year, the response was significant. A professor of restoration ecology at a university in Iowa contacted her, then a journalist from an agricultural publication in the region. Then, in what she would later describe as the strangest afternoon of her adult life, a representative from the same Consolidated Prairie Seed Company whose Mr. Ashford had stood at her fence 5 years earlier and told her she was wasting time. This representative was a younger man. Earnest in the way that people are earnest, when they've been sent to repair a relationship they weren't present for the original damage of. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her that the company had been tracking her results, that they were very impressed, that the regenerative agriculture space was now a significant area of corporate investment, and that they would like to discuss a licensing arrangement for her corridor design. The planting sequence, the species selection, the integration with existing hive management protocols. He had a figure in his head. It was a large figure, He named it. Veda looked at him for a moment. Then she looked out the kitchen window at the East 40, which was in its 6th summer now, and looked, finally, the way it was supposed to look, dense and layered and alive with movement. Nothing like a field, nothing like a product, more like a section of the original prairie that this land had been before anyone put a plow to it. "The design isn't mine," she said. "It's my father's observations and 40 years of what the bees were trying to tell him, and 3 years of research I did in the winter, and 2 years of watching the plants fail before they didn't. You can't license any of that. It doesn't exist as a thing you can own." The young man blinked. He had not expected this answer. He had prepared for negotiation, not for philosophy. "What you're describing," Veda continued, "is something every beekeeper in the country could do if they spent one winter reading the literature and one summer listening to their hives. The reason they don't isn't that they need your company's template. It's that nobody's told them that the answer isn't a product. It's an observation." She paused. "My father spent 40 years making observations. That's the whole business model. I don't think you can put that in a box." The young man drove away with his figure unspoken. He left her his card, which she put in the drawer with the other cards she had been collecting. From people who wanted to turn her father's patient watching into something they could sell. The long view, as always, tells the truest story. In the decade that followed, Veda did something quiet and deliberate. She didn't expand dramatically. She didn't take on debt. She didn't rebrand the operation or hire a marketing team or apply for the grants that various foundations kept trying to give her for the purposes they had already decided the money should accomplish. She did something simpler. She talked to her neighbors. Not the big operations, not Mr. Grover, who had retired and whose land had been bought by an out-of-state investment firm, but the smaller farms, the ones where families were still making the decisions, the ones where a person could still drive up a gravel road and find someone who remembered what the county had looked like 30 years ago and had some complicated feelings about what it looked like now. She talked to a woman named Patsy who ran a small vegetable operation to the west and was having trouble with pollination. She talked to the family 2 miles south who kept a few hives as a side business and couldn't figure out why their colonies kept dwindling every February. She walked their land with them. She showed them her father's notebooks. Not the specific entries, just the idea of them, just the practice of watching and writing down what you saw. She helped 5 of them plant corridors, small ones at first, 10 acres, 15, fence lines and field edges, and the wet corners that weren't worth cropping anyway. She didn't charge for it. She lent them her extra plugs and helped them source native seed at cost from the nursery that had supplied her originally. In exchange, she asked only for their observation notes, whatever they were writing down, whatever they were noticing. By the time Veda was in her late 30s, the county had something it had not had in a generation, a network, not a formal one, nothing with bylaws or a board of directors. In the original sense, a network in the original sense, a series of connections between living things, each node supporting the ones beside it. The corridors on the farms around her were becoming travel routes for the bees. Pollinators were moving through the landscape in patterns that the county hadn't seen since the 1950s. A graduate student from the university showed up one summer to do a transect study and found native bee species that local records hadn't documented in 40 years. Mr. Grover's old land, now managed by the investment firm, was still clean corn, still efficient, still profitable by the numbers on a spreadsheet, and it sat in the middle of this quiet, slowly mending landscape like a missing tooth, present, functional in its way, but pointing to an absence that everyone who worked the land nearby could feel. If you drove down that county road today, you would see a woman in her early 40s walking the East 40 in the early morning, the way her father used to walk it, stopping and crouching and pressing her fingers into the soil, watching the insects move through the blooms. She walks it most mornings in every season. In winter, she walks it just to look at the structure of the dried seed heads, the way they stand in the snow, the way the birds work through them. She has learned over years to see what her father could only partially see. The whole system, the connections, the way the bees and the forbs and the soil and the birds are all in conversation with each other all the time, in a language that rewards patience and punishes the belief that any single input could substitute for the whole. On the desk in the farmhouse, the same desk, the same warped floor, Leonard's 40 notebooks sit in a stack. Beside them is a stack of Veda's own notebooks, which are now, after 12 years, nearly as tall. The entries are different in style, more precise in their scientific framing, more connected to the literature. But the fundamental gesture is the same. A person standing still in a field and writing down what they see, in the faith that if you watch long enough and honestly enough, the land will tell you what it needs. There is a teenage boy from the neighboring farm who has taken to coming over on Saturdays, the son of the family she helped with their first corridor 6 years ago. He has her father's habit of going quiet near the hives, of lying in the grass and watching. She doesn't lecture him. She shows him the notebooks. She has him open hive frames and identify what he sees. She teaches him to distinguish pollen types by color, to read the traffic at the entrance, to notice what the bees are choosing and what they're leaving behind. One Saturday in early July, he crouched beside her at the edge of the bergamot planting and watched the bees work for a long time without saying anything. Then he asked, in the way teenagers ask things they actually care about, as if the question is almost too serious to say out loud, "How did your dad know that something was wrong, I mean?" Before the bees started dying, Veda thought about that for a moment. He didn't know, she said. He just kept watching. He watched for so long that eventually the bees couldn't hide it anymore. The boy nodded slowly. He picked up a stem of bergamot and turned it in his fingers, watching the bees track the bloom. And Veda watched him watching and thought about her father lying on his stomach in front of the hive entrance, and thought about the notebooks on the desk, and thought about the way a thing that one person notices in silence can become, given enough time and enough faithful watching, the thing that saves the whole world around it. That is what Leonard Croft knew without knowing he knew it. And it is what Veda spent her life proving, one season at a time, in the quiet language of the land. That the world does not need to be forced. It needs to be listened to. And if you are patient enough, and stubborn enough, and willing enough to carry the weight of other people's laughter, the land will answer you back. It always does.